is a height of absurdity, where you can actually produce the minutes of 2 meetings in 1972 that the British had with the IRA. And who were the 2 representatives? Daithí O'Connell and Gerry Adams. I mean, unless Adams was there to make the tea or represent St Vincent de Paul or something.
In what capacity did you attend the negotiations with Mr. Whitelaw in 1972?
Myself and Daithí O'Connell went along to negotiate.
But they didn't have you there as a political organiser, did they?
Oh, of course they had me there as a negotiator.
Right, but
Right.
in what capacity were you there?
I was there as part of a negotiating team.
Of the IRA?
No, of the Republican movement.
Was that what it was called?
Well, that's what it's always been called.
It was called then a group of IRA negotiators trying to negotiate a truce with the British government.
Presumably then Mr. Whitelaw broke the law.
The IRA was to field a top-level delegation. It included Martin McGuinness, the commander of the Derry Brigade, the IRA's Adjutant General and Chief Political Strategist David O'Connell, Sean McStearfan, the Chief of Staff, and Seamus Toomey, the hardline Belfast commander. Another member was a young man who'd become a Republican in 1966 and risen to become the alleged commander of Belfast's Ballymurphy Battalion. His name was Gerry Adams. All were IRA?
Yes. Not Sinn Féin, but IRA.
All of them?
Yes.
Including Martin McGuinness?
Oh, yes.
Including Gerry Adams?
Well, all of them.
I can explain why he denied it at the beginning. Once he said he was in the IRA, he could be prosecuted for membership of the IRA.
But why does he continue to deny?
Well, once he got himself into that position, it's difficult to say, well, I've changed my mind. You know, I was actually in the IRA. Now it has got to the point of ridicule.
The meeting actually took place at the home of Paul Shannon, and there we met with William Whitelaw.
In the course of that meeting, I became absolutely convinced that the British weren't sincere or genuine. Whitelaw said, well, if this breaks down, it's all bets off.
Friday, 21st of July, 1972. Between 2 and 4 o'clock, 22 bomb explosions went off within a mile of Belfast city centre. The army said the warnings had been inadequate, the provisionals that the army had not acted on them. Nine people were killed, 130 injured. At this bus station, 6 died, blown quite literally to pieces. That day is remembered as Bloody Friday. Dawn, 10 days later. The army moved into both Protestant and Catholic no-go areas. The province was experiencing over 4 explosions and nearly 50 shooting incidents a day. Bloody Friday had made it imperative for Whitelaw to act. It also made it easy.
It's very, very simple. I don't live at home. I live wherever I happen to be.
Do you change house every night?
Well, I changed house as security demands. Some 14 months later, after I had been on the run, I was arrested, and myself and a number of people were beaten. And a number of plainclothes British soldiers were engaged in the beating, and one kept saying to me, "It's all bets off now, Gerry." Do you remember that?
By June 1973, been on the run for almost 3 years. I was in a house on the Falls Road. The house was surrounded, and the British Army were in the back and the front and came through the front door. Myself, Gerry Adams and Tom Cahill were then formally arrested.
There's no possibility of a struggle ever stopping now until freedom is achieved.
I think that armed struggle in pursuance of independence is quite legitimate and is a necessary tactic.
There's also breaking news tonight from Northern Ireland. Politician Gerry Adams has been arrested in connection with a 1972 murder committed by the Irish Republican Army.
This is the woman whose murder Gerry Adams is being questioned about, Jean McConville. The IRA accused her of being a police informer, abducted her, shot her, and buried her in an unmarked grave. This woman, Dolores Price, drove the car that night and admitted so in an interview with CBS News a year and a half ago.
And did you understand at that point what the likely consequences of your delivering her would be?
I was aware that that would possibly that would be her end. Yeah.
This many years later, does it bother you?
No. No, not at all.
Price, who has since died, has accused Gerry Adams of ordering the killing and a bombing she carried out in London.
Who sent me to London to blow it up?
Who?
Gerry Adams.
Disappearance of Jean McConville was a surprise to you?
I didn't know.
It was known to the IRA.
Yes, absolutely.
And you're saying you didn't know?
Yes.
How do you orphan 10 children? What kind of depravity is that?
That's what happens in war, Scott. That's not to minimize it. That's what American soldiers do, British soldiers do, Irish Republican soldiers do. You know, that's what happens in every single conflict.
In 2014, Adams was detained for 4 days in relation to the 1972 kidnap, murder and disappearance of Jean McConville. His arrest came in the wake of the release of the Boston tapes, recordings of the former IRA man Brendan Hughes, which implicated Adams in the McConville case.
For a very brief period, I thought of becoming a priest or a Christian brother.
This woman was taken away and executed. Jean McConville. There's only one man that gave the order for that woman to be executed. That man, right, is now the head of Sinn Féin.
The attack on Cahir Barracks only increased O'Callaghan's standing amongst his IRA superiors. A few months later, aged only 19, he was to be given a mission that would change his life forever: the assassination of RUC Special Branch Inspector Peter Flanagan.
Peter Flanagan was based in Belfast in Palace Barracks in Hollywood in the early days of the Troubles, which it had finished up having a pretty bad reputation for ill treatment of prisoners, etc., etc. Over in County Tyrone, where he came from, he was very well known. He was a Catholic. Not alone is he a Catholic policeman, he's a Catholic special branch officer. We were in a house in Carrickmore the night before, and we drove into Roma. Flanagan went to this bar called Broderick's most days, most lunchtimes, and I got the lad that was with me, because he was very young looking, to put his head around the door and just check he was there. Flanagan was sitting at the end of the counter reading the Irish Independent with the sport page open. And then I went in through the door and the kid was in behind me. Peter Flanagan sort of glanced up and immediately sort of started to move off his chair. He kind of kept shouting, no, 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 no. Once he was on the floor, I looked at him and I realised he was dead.
A police inspector was shot dead in an Oma public house about half an hour ago. His name has not been given. Eyewitnesses saw 2 armed men run from the public house through unmanned barriers.
The thing had been done, the excitement had slowed down, and now it was on the news. And now I had actually murdered someone.
O'Callaghan and his team took refuge in a local parochial house. The priests who lived there were part of a small renegade group of IRA sympathisers within the Catholic Church.
The senior priest blessed us as we came in. There was a holy water font inside the door. He described Peter Flanagan as an awful man, or a terrible, evil man, something like that. And he wanted to assure us that we hadn't committed a sin. He was very anxious to assure us that, in case we had any doubts, that we could always talk to him, but what we had done was okay.
And 12 people died on the 4th of February when a bomb exploded on a coach on the M62. The coach was transporting soldiers to Catterick Camp in Yorkshire after weekend leave.
When I got on the bus, I was probably sat about the second row down from the back of the coach. I had a friend that was on the coach, Stephen Worley, who was sat probably midway from the front. Stephen wanted to swap places with me, so I swapped places with Stephen. We'd just passed the Bradford turning. There was a sort of a whoosh noise. It wasn't like an explosion, it was like a whoosh. The coach swerved and the driver had actually got the coach onto the hard shoulder. And when I looked back, the seat behind me was actually hanging down and the rest of the coach had disappeared.
Philip's friend, 18-year-old Stephen Worley, was killed, along with 11 others, including 2 young children.
We knew that a bomb had been planted, and we knew who planted it, that it was the IRA.
Two bomb blasts in 2 public houses here in Birmingham city centre, the Tavern in the Town pub in New Street and the Mulberry Bush at the bottom of the Rotunda.
The pub itself is a cellar pub and you have to go down some stairs.
That night, under one of the tables, someone had left a bomb. Packed inside a briefcase and triggered by 2 timer devices, the bomb had a strange distinctive feature. Pushed into the face of each of the alarm clocks was a Phillips head screw. It was a trademark of James McDade. He's thought to have made the timer devices shortly before his death. On November the 14th, IRA bomber James McDade was blown up by one of his own devices. The following Thursday, his body was taken to Birmingham Airport to be flown home. 300 yards from the tavern, another bomb had been left inside a second pub, the Mulberry Bush. It was at the base of Birmingham's most famous landmark, the Rotunda, and next door to British Rail's New Street station.
From what I know and what I've been told, Dad had finished his duty and gone into the Mulberry Bush for some cigarettes.
Trevor Thrupp was still in the Mulberry Bush at 11 minutes past 8 when Birmingham's Post and Mail newspaper received a call. A man with an Irish accent gave a known IRA code word, XX. He said 2 bombs had been planted in Birmingham's city centre. 30 pounds of blasting explosive had ripped through the Mulberry Bush, 10 times the amount used at either Guildford or Woolwich.
There used to be a staircase go up in the middle of the Mulberry Bush, and this thing was just flattened. It had just come down. It was just lying there as if the staircase was level instead of going up.
I'd got my torch out. The beam just cut through the dust and the smoke, and I could see bits of concrete and bits of furniture and clothing and people, bits of body. I'm aware that I trod on human beings.
The Mulberry Bush bomb killed 10 people. 2 of the dead were passers-by, found in the rubble outside. 11 people had been killed instantly by the blast.
There were just bits of... You knew they were people, but what part? You just couldn't tell. It was just like lumps of meat lying on the floor.
The police began the task of identifying those who'd died.
On the railway they have, not like a dog tag, but it's like a serial number. So if there's anything, if they're lost or anything like that, they've got their own personal serial number. Well, they found that. So obviously they knew it belonged to Trevor Thrupp, so they came to the house. Where he actually died from was a piece of wood that went straight into his throat, which killed him instantly.
Trevor Thrupp, who'd only popped into the Mulberry Bush to buy a packet of cigarettes, was one of 21 people killed that night.
A former IRA volunteer known only as Witness O claimed James Gavin, Mick Murray and Michael Hayes were all involved in the bombings, along with Seamus McLaughlin, said to be the commanding officer who selected the targets. It's the first time they've ever been named in a formal setting like this. The witness said he had authority from the current head of the IRA to identify them. And he was asked about a fifth man, Michael Patrick Riley. "No, I don't remember him at all," he said. The barrister asked, "He's the one you're protecting, isn't he?" The witness replied, "Who? Protecting who? No."
I have spoken to half a dozen former and serving senior police officers on both sides of the border, as well as members of the Republican community, and they have suggested I seek out leaders of the IRA in the area at the time. One name keeps coming up: Brian Smith. An IRA operative in the 1970s and based in Dundalk for most of the Troubles, Brian Smith is now back living in South Armagh. I catch up with him in Newry. Brian Smith, Darragh McIntyre from the BBC. I'd like to ask you about Robert Narrock.
I never heard tell of him. I know nothing about Robert Narrock.
Never heard tell of him?
I heard tell of him in papers.
Brian, you were the leader of the IRA in North Louth at the time.
Somebody's having you on. Somebody's winding you up.
Brian Smith, why won't the IRA give up Robert Narrock's body?
I would suggest that you would ask Mr. Adams and Mr. McGuinness that.
The men were ordered out, lined up alongside their van, and shot. Over 100 rounds were fired. 10 Protestant mill workers died.
The noise of the gunfire was deafening. It's something I'll never ever forget. And what they'd done, they'd shot us all at waist level, supposed to stop anyone from running away. And that lasted maybe 10 seconds. And the next thing, I was hit multiple times, and so was everyone else. But it was absolutely awful because there was screams of pain. There was some of them weren't able to scream and they were moaning, they were groaning. My 19-year-old apprentice, he fell across my legs, and it was absolutely horrific. He was calling for his mommy. Mommy, mommy, mommy. And the next thing, the gunfire stopped, and the same guy that had done all the talking said, "Finish them off." And the shooting became more measured. And Robert was still calling for his mummy. And I seen the boots of the gunman, and I seen the tips of the rifle, and they blew his face away. That's something that lived with me till the day I die. And he was such a lovely lad, and calling for his mummy and getting his face blown off. It was absolutely horrific.
9 of the men who died in the King's Mills massacre came from Bessbrook. Built around the mill, the Brook, as it's known locally, was then a tightly knit Protestant community, strictly run by a Quaker family. No pubs, no betting shops. It was widely known as the Model Village.
Last week, the newest shopping complex in the centre of Belfast was blown up, part of an economic war. The IRA have learned that crude extortion is no longer enough to fund terrorism, so they've developed a sophisticated financial infrastructure.
But behind many of the high street facades of places like pizza parlours, video shops and estate agents, the money comes from and goes to the provisional IRA. The boys are going legit.
Well, what we've got now is the pinstripe terrorists. They're involved in almost anything legitimate they can get into, and in fact they have the money that enables them to buy into anything. So that people drink in their clubs, they go to work in their transport, they enjoy themselves in taxi companies that they own, they eat out of their fast food parlours.
Estate agents are particularly attractive to the IRA, says Councillor Brian Feeney.
The major attraction of the estate agent is the client's account. So that one week you can have perhaps £160,000, £170,000. A fortnight later, £27.50, because you can say these were clients' money and you've sold the premises or the deal fell through. It's untraceable.
So are these businesses wholly owned subsidiaries of the IRA?
Well, they might be regarded as IRA incorporated. Sometimes they're not wholly owned. Sometimes there are individuals who have to do what they're told, and if they don't, they'll be shot.
This dead man was an estate agent, a frontman for the IRA. He was kidnapped, tortured for 3 days, and publicly executed earlier this year. He was Joe Fenton, aged 35, a married man with 4 children. Financial nerve center for the IRA lies inside the Conway Street Mill.
The Conway Street Mill has in it a number of legitimate businesses and activities, but nevertheless it's used as a major front by Sinn Féin as a cover for their financial base in the north of Ireland.
I suppose being mixed in with legitimate businesses actually makes the cover more effective.
That's the idea. It tends to legitimise the Conway Mill, and to outsiders it looks as a place of culture, business, education and publishing, in fact.
And the white spot which appears there, it obviously takes a hit. Fortunately, the pilot was able to go into, I guess, auto-rotation and land on the other side of the lock. They're running down to see what's happened and obviously follow up because it didn't catch fire, it didn't blow up. This is a ruthlessly perpetrated ambush. And it does worries people that this is relatively unsophisticated weapons. If through friendly third world countries you can get access to more sophisticated weapons, it clearly means that you could engage in more bloodthirsty, more efficient ambushes if the terrorists so wished.
The latest man to try to provide the IRA with that more sophisticated equipment arrives back home, having been deported from America. He wanted his homecoming to be secret. Donal Moyner was accused by the Americans of holding counterfeit money with which he was trying to buy laser sights for red-eye missiles. Moyner is a long-time provisional sympathizer and close colleague of fellow electronics graduate Gabriel McGahey. British police believe McGahey made the triggering devices for the bomb which devastated the lifeguards in Hyde Park. McGahey himself was filmed secretly in America trying to buy complete red-eye missiles from federal agents.
We have what you are interested in. Providing that the price is the same one, $10,000 a piece for each red-eye missile. We will handle the delivery.
See what we're doing here. What is happening here with this? What we're dealing with here at the minute, money-wise, is you.
That's right.
Nothing.
That's right. That's our problem.
Right. Our problem is this. Once we hit the first one, right, and it is a science and we build the relationship up, then we're prepared to move a lot of big money.
Then the IRA man gave this warning.
There's one thing I know. I'm going to deal with something going on.
McGahey was jailed for 7 years for attempting to buy those missiles. Meanwhile, in Britain, the police want to question him about other outrages like this one in Chelsea, where an innocent woman died. The police say the detonation system bore all the hallmarks of his work. The possession of bomb-detonating devices, including memo parks, is one of the charges the British authorities would like to lay against Father Ryan. Receipts prove Ryan purchased at least 500 memo parks.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Father Patrick Ryan.
This Thursday, Father Ryan is a candidate for the European elections. The Irish authorities refuse to extradite him to Britain and are still deciding whether or not to charge him themselves.
Extradition is not just another issue. It affects the very liberty of every Irish person.
We've traced Ryan's 20-year journey around Europe, raising money and, it seems, buying arms. This document, a statement given to an IRA court-martial by a member of the Provisional's Army Council, names Ryan as being involved in an arms-buying deal as long ago as 1971 in Amsterdam. At this bank, Ryan had 2 accounts, one in Zurich, one in Geneva. Between 1973 and 1976, more than £750,000 passed through those accounts. The money came mainly from two sources, one of them Libya's Colonel Gaddafi. It was in Zurich that Ryan discovered the memo park. From this firm in the centre of the city, he bought memo parks by the hundred. Over 18 months, Ryan's memo parks were used, it's alleged, in 185 bombs, including London's Oxford Street.
A Remembrance Day atrocity in Northern Ireland. A bomb has killed 11 and injured more than 60. It was planted a few yards from the war memorial in Inniskillin. It went off without warning as the remembrance crowds were gathering. A building collapsed on top of them. 13 children are among the injured.
The most callous of all IRA atrocities, the Enniskillen bombing, also relied on a memo park like the ones Father Ryan purchased. 11 people died and 63 were injured on Remembrance Sunday in 1987. Colonel Hugh Heap, the Army's chief bomb disposal officer in Northern Ireland, later revealed the increasingly familiar workings of the bomb's timing device.
But this one is unique to the IRA.
Unique in part because of its use of the memo park.
For Peter Rogers, it's a long way from the North Antrim coast to Wexford in the far south, and some of the key moments in his life. At one time, he was regarded as an IRA hero after he escaped from the Maidstone prison ship in 1972. He continued his paramilitary activities in the Republic, and he alleges that in 1980, around the time of the first hunger strike, he was summoned to a meeting with his superior officers, Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, in the grounds of Trinity College, Dublin. The reason? Because he claims he was reluctant to move unstable explosives to Britain for a bombing campaign. The liquid-like substance, which gave off a strong smell of marzipan, he says, posed a risk both to the bombers' lives and to their security.
When I met with them, Gerry wanted to know what the delay was, and I told him the delay was because of the explosives, and I asked that it be replaced. And himself and Martin stood back out of earshot of me, and they had a talk, and they came back to me. Gerry says, look, Peter, we can't replace that explosives. You'll have to go with what you have. No? And as soon as you can get it across, the better. So, as far as I was concerned, I was given a direct order to go with this very unstable explosive.
Are you absolutely sure about that? Because Gerry Adams has said he was never in the IRA, and Martin McGuinness says he left the IRA in 1974. In fact, he swore an oath to that effect at the Bloody Sunday inquiry.
Well, that might be so, you know, but I know that over the years, that there's been that many lies told in order to get to where they are at the present time of the peace process.
Peter Rogers says he has every reason to remember the alleged Trinity College meeting. A short time after it, back in Wexford, his van with the explosives was stopped by detectives. There was a gun battle, and he murdered Garda Seamus Quaid. Garda Donal Littleton was injured.
Well, Rogers claimed, as you say, that these guns and explosives were destined for the North. The Gardaí never believed that. They believed that they were destined for Britain, where they'd be used in a pre-Christmas bombing blitz in London or elsewhere.
As it turned out, there was only one bombing in London before Christmas. That was at a Territorial Army barracks in Hammersmith. The bomb caused considerable damage, but claimed no lives.
And is sometimes forgotten when you think of the tragedy of the actual killing, that by stopping Rogers on that day, Garda Quaid and Garda Littleton saved many, many lives. The many lives would have been lost if that bombing blitz had gone ahead, and many people have been injured. But by stopping Rogers, they prevented that.
I do feel there was a lot of victims out of the Seamus Quaid killing. Number one, the Quaid family, Mrs. Quaid, had lost her husband and a father to her children. Mrs. Rogers had effectively lost her husband to a life in prison, and her child had no father. He was denied a father in his upbringing.
Peter Rogers was initially sentenced to death, but then given a 40-year sentence for capital murder. 9 years into his sentence in Portlaoise, he left the Republican movement after writing to the Quaid family and Garda Littleton, apologising for what he had done. He was released under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement.
Well, by definition, any killing of another human being by another human being is a murder, of course, and I have condemned the killing of Gardaí, of the Defence Force members who were killed.
The hunt for Don Tidy's kidnappers and the killers of a Garda recruit and army private has been described as the biggest combined Garda army operation in the history of the state.
This morning I travelled to Carrickmacross, where I met the father and mother of Garda recruit Sheehan.
The area around the hideout in Drumcrumman Wood, where Don Tidy was held by his IRA captors, has over the past few weeks been the scene of an exhaustive forensic examination.
On this ditch was the body of Private Kelly. Some 12 feet away was the body of Garda Sheehan. It is more difficult to deal with when it's a colleague, a Garda colleague, and particularly a young person doing their job. It's always sad to come across somebody who's been shot down whilst doing just their job of work.
However, I personally feel at this moment in time it is indeed tinged with the utmost sadness for those who at this very moment, on this very beautiful day, are saddened by the loss of loved ones.
It took less than 5 minutes this afternoon for the 3 judges at the Special Criminal Court to discharge Brendan Bick McFarlane from the dock and state that he's entitled to the presumption of innocence of the charges of kidnapping Don Tidy and possession of a firearm 25 years ago.
In a long 10 years, and it's been an extremely difficult period for myself and my family. What I want to do now is put this behind me and move on.
A colour party of 7 men and 2 women wearing paramilitary clothing lined up alongside the remains. The coffin was carried by members of Mr. Liner's family, including his brother Colm, who had been released on parole from Portlaoise prison to attend the funeral. When the cortege had walked through the County Monaghan village, 3 men in paramilitary dress and carrying rifles stepped forward from the crowd and fired several volleys of shots over the remains.
Gil! 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 Gil!
The firing party disappeared into the crowd, who had linked hands to keep the small number of Gardaí away from the coffin. In the confusion that followed, Gardaí ran down a side road in an attempt to intercept members of the firing party. Sections of the crowd followed them. 2 red vans had been parked at the side of the road, and as the vehicles attempted to pull away, some of the crowd attacked Gardaí. At one stage, a detective fired a machine gun into the air as the crowd closed in and overturned the Garda car. Another shot was fired by a detective as the vehicle lay upside down in a ditch. Another detective was trapped inside for a short time and had to break a back window to escape. His colleagues helped him from the vehicle.
Let's look at the killing of Mr. Stack. At that time in that prison, there were INLA prisoners, there were Republican prisoners. It was a very, very cruel regime. 1 Republican prisoner was killed.
Did the IRA kill him?
I don't know.
Do you really not know?
No, I don't really know. And if I did, I would say to you, I was actually in by complete fluke. I was in holidays down in Galway and came back up and was in the Coolies at the time that Tom Oliver was killed. I was with my family in the Coolies at that time.
There is a strong belief, though, that in fact you were the Court of Appeal that said Tom Oliver should go to his death.
How can you? No. How can? There is a strong belief. How can you come on this programme and say that, Miriam? Now you're a journalist. How can you come on that programme?
Because in this, I'm speaking to you about the actions of Republicans, and you're here as a leader of the Republicans, so I have to put those questions to you.
That's a different thing from accusing me of saying, without, I mean, what are your source?
In relation to
No, sorry, Miriam, you cannot just come on a programme and say, it is widely believed, or it is believed that you were in a court of appeal.
Widely believed by members of his family?
Miriam.
Yes, that is the case, Gerry. Right. Let's move to the disappeared, actually. Jean McConville, as you know, was the infamous case in 1972. Two former colleagues of yours, including Brendan Hughes, who did say at one stage, Gerry, that he loved you, he felt so close to you. There are those great photos of you together in the maze, giving each other hugs. Both he and Dolores Price both said that you were responsible for Jean McConville's disappearance.
I've answered this accusation many times. Many times. They were telling lies.
Why would they lie?
Because they are people who, as they went on in their lives, became opponents, thought that I sold out, thought that I was a traitor, thought that I should be killed. My wife always says she would trust Martin McGuinness with her life. She doesn't say that about me, but...
David Dunn, Conservative Party leader! The leader of Irish Republicanism!
Bobby Sands' election to Westminster during the height of the hunger strikes in 1981 was a catalyst for the rise of Sinn Féin. And in 1983, Adams was elected to Westminster, though in keeping with Sinn Féin's abstentionist policy, he never took his seat. Later that year, he was elected president of Sinn Féin.
Eventually, cameramen were told to stop filming and threatened.
Put them away, lads.
The bodies of the soldiers were found in an alley.
In the mid-1980s, a Catholic priest, Father Alec Reid, became a conduit between Gerry Adams, John Hume and the Irish government. These talks led to the beginning of the peace process and finally to the first IRA ceasefire in August 1994.
In June 1993, Scappaticci's unit closed in on another victim. Joseph Mulhern was killed as an informer by the IRA, a brutal warning to the Republican community of the consequences of talking to the security forces. The intention was not just to warn, but to terrify. A message Scappaticci delivered in person to Joseph Mulhern's father.
It wasn't long after I'd buried my son. It was a warm day and I heard a car pulling up behind me and Scap get out. And he came over, shook hands, asked how things were. I knew that he would have been there and I asked how he died. He said that the first shot had hit him in the back of the neck and he shouted at the guy who'd shot him to shoot him again, so apparently the second shot hit him in the back of the head. That's something I never knew.
1994, the year of the IRA ceasefire and the year the IRA murdered Caroline Morland, a young mother of 3 children seen here on a peace march a year before she was killed. This housing estate in West Belfast, home to her family. It's also where Caroline Morland was taken captive by the IRA. She was held for a fortnight, tortured and made to record an admission to working with Special Branch. Played here by Spotlight reporter Dara McIntyre, the recording also had a warning.
And you just come forward and tell what you're doing. No harm will come to you and you'll be helped.
Caroline Morland wasn't helped, she was murdered. Her body dumped along the Fermanagh-Monaghan border.
Horrific sight. Something that words couldn't explain. Mutilated.
According to Dolores Price, Brendan Hughes, you were the commanding officer in Belfast in 1972. Are there any murders that you feel responsible for?
No.
In July 1979, the Maxwell family were settling into their holiday when they were approached by a local woman who asked if their son Paul would be interested in a summer job.
She was given the job of trying to find somebody who would act as a boat boy for the summer, basically. And she asked me if Paul would be willing to do it, and I asked him, and he was really over the moon about it, and he got the job.
The tide was quite low, so Lord Mountbatten, being 79 years of age, an elderly man, and the Dowager Lady Brabourne, Patricia Brabourne, was 83. I helped them down onto the boat. Timothy and Nicholas Natchwell, twin sons, 14 years of age, and Paul Maxwell were in the main body of the boat then.
I was up reading the paper at the back of the cottage. I suppose it would have been maybe 11 o'clock or 11:30 or something like that.
I was looking down at the cliff face, directly down onto the boat. It was an enormous explosion.
It just riz clean out of the water. It went straight up into there. It didn't spread out at all. It just went straight up. And it seemed to go up into the air for about, to me, like 5 seconds before there was an unmerciful explosion. People screaming in the water and shouting.
I kind of knew straight away that it was a bomb. And I jumped into the car, and there was a Garda there. And he confirmed that it was, Mountbatten's boat. And I thought, gosh, nobody could have survived that. And I kind of lost the head to some extent, I suppose, for want of a better way of putting it, and thought to myself, I'll climb down this cliff face and I'll see if I can find any sign of Paul in the water.
We had to hold him. The field was just on the edge of a cliff and there was nothing but rocks below. If he had jumped, he would have jumped to his death, and he was so distressed. He could hear the shouts in the water too, not knowing, I suppose, if that was his son or who it was.
At that stage also, quite a lot of boats that had been in the vicinity of the explosion itself had gone to the scene, and they were starting to remove the survivors and the casualties from the water.
I met a man on the harbour, and he said there's some survivors of this, and one of them is Paul, and he's in the Pierhead Hotel. So I felt a fantastic sense of relief at that point, and ran into the Pierhead Hotel and went up and saw this boy lying. The twins, the Natchbull twins, were fair-haired, like Paul. And at first I thought it was Paul, but it turned out that it was Tim. And that was a huge letdown, of course, because then I had to start looking for Paul again. I went back down onto the harbour, and there was a boat there, and a man I know said that he had Paul's body on the boat. So I went onto the boat. Paul was just lying there, and his head was in a bucket of mackerel. And I picked him up, and his body was still warm. So I thought he might be alive, but he wasn't.
I clearly, as a Republican leader, will think back over all of the period, that words of mine, that actions of mine, that stances that I took, and I don't distance myself from the IRA. I've never distanced myself from the IRA, and until the day I die, I will not distance myself from the IRA.
Well, by saying you were never in it, of course, it does distance you from it.
But bear with me.
And with respect, you do act like you know absolutely nothing about even the murder of Brian Stack, and maybe that will worry them, that even if they meet you, or even if there was a peace and reconciliation forum, that the truth ultimately would not be told. You are currently the leader of Sinn Féin, but you were also, according to many people, the commanding officer in West Belfast. It was a bloody conflict on both sides. People suffered on both sides. But are you honestly saying to me tonight that there's no murder whatsoever, no death, no killing, that you feel in any way responsible for?
Well, I've already answered that question. I'm not going to keep repeating my answer.
But you were in the IRA.
Well, I've already answered that one many, many, many times. I accept full responsibility for anything that I did in all of my political life.
You're not denying your role in the IRA tonight?
I have already denied my role in the IRA. I don't want to keep repeating.
Let me ask you another. What about the forgotten people? I mentioned Tom Oliver, but even Eamon Collins, who actually sat in a primetime studio with me a few weeks before he was murdered by the IRA. Do you ever worry about people like that, or feel and think about them? Or are they justifiable victims of the war?
Collins himself was in the IRA's internal security unit known as the Nutting Squad. Through his involvement with this unit, he knew that when he crossed the IRA, he had made enemies who would never forgive him.
I have faced for 10 years of my life some very difficult moments, and I have faced them standing on my own 2 feet, alone. And I have never run away from anything. And if it costs me my life, well, so be it.
He did take security precautions, especially over the last couple of months as threats against him increased. He often wore a bulletproof vest.
He actually had been wearing it when he went out to paint out the graffiti. But a bulletproof vest's not much good when you're hit on the head and stabbed in the face.
Well, first of all, I mean, what happens in war is dreadful, and you've heard me say this a million times, that we should not seek to glamorise war. War is horrific.
Charlie McElmurray's body was found in this van on Sunday. He'd been tortured and shot in the head, branded an informer by the IRA.
I think that Mr. McElmurray, like anyone else living in West Belfast, knows that the consequence for informing is death.
Adams was granted a visa to attend a peace conference in the United States in 1994 by US President Bill Clinton.
They haven't gone away, you know.
An hour after the ceasefire ended in 1996, the IRA detonated a huge lorry bomb in Canary Wharf, killing 2 people.
An enormous explosion in Docklands, which killed 2, was the IRA's declaration a 17-month-long ceasefire was over. Newsagents Inam Bashir and John Jeffries died when a half-ton bomb concealed in the lorry detonated near to South Quay DLR station, the force shredding nearby buildings, causing £150 million worth of property damage. The blast was so large, it was felt at Canary Wharf.
It was just after 11:20 when the blast went off outside the busy shopping centre. A coded warning had been received by a local television station at 10 o'clock. The police had begun to evacuate the city. A bomb disposal team was checking out a suspicious van outside the shopping centre when the bomb exploded. Screaming shoppers fled from the scene, huge numbers of them injured by flying glass. Several are still said to be in a serious condition tonight. Ambulance crews here said that if the evacuation had not taken place, many could have died. Everybody in this city heard the blast.
Saw glass falling everywhere, people hurt, blood all over the place, people screaming. It was really terrifying, it was very, very scary.
People now know why Sinn Féin aren't involved in the peace talks until such time as there's a complete and unequivocal ceasefire from the IRA. I think people will watch very clearly to see whether there is a clear-cut and unequivocal condemnation of this action today by Mr. Adams and by Sinn Féin. I expect there to be so, and I hope he will do it swiftly and comprehensively.
We have always been critical privately and have never attempted to condone any operations which have led to civilian casualties or led to civilian deaths. Ultimately, the responsibility for all of these deaths lies with the British government.
For nearly 40 years, the main paramilitary player in Ireland has been the Provisional IRA. Now, to run their war, they needed money, a lot of money, and most of it was dirty.
One of the seminal events that led to the creation of the Criminal Assets Bureau was the murder of Detective Garda Gerry McCabe in June 1996. Gerry McCabe was ambushed by volunteers of the Munster Brigade of the Provisional IRA, who set out to rob a post office van in Adair, County Limerick. The gang led by Kevin Walsh wanted old age pensioners' money in order to maintain their so-called war in Northern Ireland and to help fund Sinn Féin's vision of a socialist republic.
Well, in fairness to them, what they did was carry out this act, having been authorised by someone within the IRA.
In 1998, after months of negotiations, the parties and the government signed the Good Friday Agreement.
Man has been found guilty of the murder of Stephen Restorick, the last British soldier to have been killed by the IRA. Bandit Michael McGinn was also found guilty at Belfast Crown Court of murdering 2 other soldiers in 1993 and in 1978. He was part of an IRA sniper team in South Armagh, which was responsible for the deaths of 9 soldiers and RUC officers.
The powerful American-made Barrett Light 50 rifle used by the IRA team has an accuracy range of up to half a mile. For 7 years it was used in South Armagh, turning the area into one of the most feared zones for security forces in Northern Ireland. The weapon was protected by an armoured plated Mazda car. The rifle was used to kill Lance Bombardier Stephen Restrick, who died at a checkpoint in Bessbrook, County Armagh in February 1997. A woman motorist was grazed in the attack. Restrick's last words to his colleagues were asking about her well-being. Today at Belfast Crown Court, 41-year-old Bernard Michael McGinn from Castleblaney in County Monaghan was convicted of Restrick's murder. McGinn was also found guilty of the murder of Lance Bombardier Paul Garrett in South Armagh in 1993 and former Ulster Defence Regiment soldier Thomas Johnston in 1978. Prosecutors said he also admitted making the bombs used at Canary Wharf and the Baltic Exchange in London. 3 other Armagh men, Michael Colum Carraher from Cullyhanna, Martin Mines of Silver Bridge and James McCardle of Crossmaglen, were found guilty with McGinn of possessing the Barrett Light 50 rifle at a farm in Crossmaglen. The 4 defendants refused to stand up and recognise the court when sentenced. They then laughed and waved to friends as they were taken away by prison officers to begin their jail term. However, under the Good Friday Agreement, they will walk free within a year and a half.
In August 2001, after failing to meet 2 deadlines, the IRA finally began the process of disarmament.
All IRA units have been ordered to dump arms.
After extensive talks between Adams and Ian Paisley, a historic agreement was reached and Sinn Féin and the DUP joined in the Northern Executive.
Which the First Minister began by saying, I'll explain this, he said, there's you, a young man of 54 just going out of office, and here's me, a man of 80 coming in.
For years, the Provisional IRA have cooperated with international terror gangs, with outfits like ETA in Spain and the FARC narco-terrorists in Colombia, who are funded solely through the production of cocaine. Weapons, expertise, funds and narcotics have all been exchanged in gestures of revolutionary solidarity.
If anything that Gerry Adams has just said about his concern about drugs is true, it's given the total lie that when he was a member of the Army Council of the IRA, he sent a team of people to exchange Provo know-how in making mortars for $25 million from narco-terrorists who made all of that money selling cocaine.
3 Irish men leave prison in Bogotá in June last year. Free men after being cleared of training the FARC, left-wing guerrillas in Colombia. In the front seat, Katrina Ruan, Sinn Féin MLA and head of the Bring Them Home campaign.
We brought them to a safe place. I stayed with them that night.
But their freedom was conditional. They had to stay in the country until an appeal by the prosecution. When the result was announced last December, they were convicted and sentenced to 17 years in prison. But they were nowhere to be found.
We left them in safe hands, and that's as far as it goes.
The Republicans are now wanted men on a terrorist alert in 182 countries. The Colombian vice president wants to know how they got away.
The Bring Him Home campaign has a lot of explaining to do to the Irish people, to the international community.
The arrests of Niall Connolly, Martin McCauley and Jim Monaghan in 2001 caused serious damage to the peace process. The allegation that the IRA, supposed to be on ceasefire, was sharing its bomb-making secrets with the FARC had the potential to bring down the devolved assembly. The 3 men were travelling on false passports. They were arrested coming from an area of the jungle which at the time was controlled by the FARC. The arrests left Sinn Féin in disarray.
I have no idea why they were there. I do not have to explain on behalf of Sinn Féin why those people were in Colombia.
But Sinn Féin did have to explain when more details emerged about the men. Jim Monaghan, seen here at a Sinn Féin conference in the late 80s, was a member until 1990. Security sources described him as head of the IRA's bomb-making department. He had an explosives conviction from the 1970s. McCauley from Lurgan was said to be his deputy. He had a weapons conviction. Connolly was harder to identify. All that was known about him was that he'd been living in Cuba.
The way in which the Colombia 3 was handled by Sinn Féin drew people's attention to a pattern of denial on the part of the Republican movement, which I think has been ultimately very, very damaging to them.
Confusion over Niall Connolly brought further embarrassment. First, a denial.
He's not a member of Sinn Féin.
Later, an admission and apology.
He had been asked by one of our senior members to represent our party, and I have apologised to everyone, including his family, for any embarrassment which our statement may have caused.
Sinn Féin's difficulties increased when a month after the arrests, the 9/11 attacks took place. Sinn Féin had always looked to the US for support, but an America that had just declared a war on terror was in no mood to tolerate those consorting with terrorists in Colombia.
Claims that these individuals were there for benign purposes, specifically ecotourism, or for activities related to the Irish and Colombian peace processes, are an insult to our intelligence.
Gerry Adams refused to testify, but earlier comments reflected the intense pressure Republicans were under to distance themselves from terrorism.
Terrorism is ethically indefensible. Those responsible for the atrocities in the United States must be brought to justice. And what happened in New York and Washington and Pennsylvania was, as the UN Human Rights Commissioner and former Irish President Mary Robinson said, a crime against humanity.
Guildford 4 member Paul Hill was also on side.
The safety of these men's world is about 320 metres. That's their living conditions. Outside of that, they'd be killed.
The publicity helped Katrina Rowan's political career. During the campaign, she joined Sinn Féin and was elected as an MLA.
She ran the campaign very, very effectively, but ran it in a way which was pretty explicit on her part, that she had nothing to do with Sinn Féin. This was not a Sinn Féin campaign. She was quite hostile when anybody suggested that she might be connected with Sinn Féin in any way, and then suddenly she pops up not just as a Sinn Féin MLA, but also someone who's accompanying Gerry Adams to Downing Street, who's clearly quite central to the Sinn Féin leadership. And it is difficult to imagine that somebody becomes a central figure in Sinn Féin simply overnight, having had no connection with the party previously.
Niall Connolly was Sinn Féin's representative here, underlining the close links between Irish Republicans and the Cuban government. There's a memorial to the hunger strikers in Havana. It was here that Gerry Adams met Fidel Castro 4 years ago. He also laid a wreath at the monument. What does the future hold for the Columbia Three? Are they going to hide until the dust settles, or will they risk returning to Ireland? There's no extradition treaty between Ireland and Colombia, but the Colombian Vice President would expect the Irish government to send them back to his country.
The big heist was the biggest cash robbery in British criminal history. The money weighed 1/4 of a ton. The political consequences were devastating. When the news broke, the Irish peace process collapsed. While British intelligence held the IRA responsible, the finger of blame was also pointed at the British government.
Some people in Ireland say the only reason why the Provisional IRA did the big heist in the first place was because the British government was turning a blind eye to the rest of the IRA's criminal activities.
The big heist was just the latest and biggest robbery in a whole series of IRA criminal operations. In May 2004, a gang held up the Macro shopping complex near Belfast. Staff were taken hostage and over £1 million worth of goods stolen. Everyone in Northern Ireland suspected the IRA, but when moderate nationalist politicians tried to get the British government to put pressure on the Provies to stop thieving, nothing happened.
The Provos were testing the resolve of the government to stand up to them, and the difficulty was that governments and others were turning a blind eye and almost pretending that it didn't happen. We drew it to the attention of the Prime Minister, we drew it to the attention of Paul Murphy, the Secretary of State, that the Provos were up to no good. I think there was a political decision made that it was a price to pay just to get some sort of semblance of political agreement.
Last September, while the Republican leaders were at Leeds Castle talking peace with Tony Blair, the IRA was planning 2 more big robberies. In Strabane, the manageress of the Iceland store was abducted, held overnight, and forced to steal £200,000. In October, a bonded warehouse manager
was forced to steal cigarettes worth £2 million. The British government again did nothing and said nothing. Finally, it was officially confirmed by former Scotland Yard counter-terrorism chief John Grieve that all of the robberies had been carried out by the IRA.
We conclude now, on the basis of information also available to us, that the Provisional IRA was also responsible for the theft of goods from Macro, the abduction of people and the robbery of goods from the Strabane branch of Iceland, and the abduction of people and the robbery of cigarettes in Belfast on the 2nd of October.
But it had taken the theft of £26.5 million from the Northern Bank to force the British government to react. I discovered that leading Irish politicians had been shocked and angered at the British government's refusal to confront the IRA at the time of the robberies.
It seems extraordinary that such widespread criminality that's carried on can be tolerated to the extent that it is, particularly, I think, by the British government. That wouldn't be tolerated in England, Scotland or Wales, but it seems to be tolerated in Northern Ireland. We may have a situation in which the authorities are looking at an acceptable level of criminality. It is fatal. You can't tolerate it, and worse still, you can't and shouldn't appease it.
The real bottom line in it all is that the Prime Minister and a lot of people around the political establishment were quite prepared to sacrifice Northern Ireland. It didn't matter much what sort of circumstances the rest of us had to live in here, as long as there weren't bombs going off in London.
Was it true that Downing Street deliberately turned a blind eye to IRA criminality for the sake of the peace process?
Okay, that's all.
To find out more, I went to see Tony Blair's man in Northern Ireland at the time.
Well, it is never an acceptable level of criminality. After the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, no one expected it to end dramatically and instantly, and that had to disappear and wither away over time. The problem is, how long does that take? And in fact, it's taken too long for that to end, and that's because we are where we are at the moment.
I mean, they say you turned a blind eye, that you should have told Gerry Adams the robberies have got to stop.
Well, the government didn't turn blind eyes. We can't do that. We're responsible for law and order in Northern Ireland, and we have to, investigate those bank robberies and catch the perpetrators if we can, and then prosecute them. So there's no blind eye so far as they're concerned. But criminality was an issue which, to be fair to them, the SDLP kept raising all the time, and in many ways, I suppose, they've been proved to be right.
Sinn Féin, Republicans are not involved in criminality, and we will not tolerate such behaviour.
But is it credible that the leaders of the Republican movement had no advance knowledge of the series of robberies that led up to and included the big heist? Michael McDowell is Ireland's Justice Minister and head of the Republic's security services, who run a network of secret informers within the IRA. He says that the orders for the robberies came right from the top, from the IRA's ruling body, the Army Council.
Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness have been for many years on the IRA Army Council. They have at all times been in control of the provisional mood in recent years, and the robberies, the series of robberies which were used to finance the IRA must have been the subject of varying degrees of knowledge but overall control of the Army Council, and nobody who serves on the Army Council could claim to be unaware of the fact that they were carrying out serious fundraising through criminality. I believe that they have, in the last 2 months, resigned from membership of the IRA Army Council, but are in overall control of the movement, and there is no challenge to their authority.
I arranged to meet a former comrade of Adams and McGuinness to find out more. John Kelly was one of the founders of the Provisional IRA. An active member for decades, he's now estranged from the IRA leadership. He's one of the few former insiders prepared to talk publicly about the inner workings of the IRA. He has never spoken on national television before.
Would Gerry Adams be aware of what all arms of the Republican movement were doing?
I go back to what the Bible said, that not a sparrow falls from the sky, but the man above doesn't know about it.
And Gerry Adams, in terms of the Republican movement, is the man above. He's God. So he knows and would want to know. And would be disappointed if he didn't know everything that happens within the Republican movement. And nothing would be hidden from him.
Is it conceivable that senior figures like Martin McGuinness and Gerry Adams could not have known about the Northern Bank robbery?
No, there's no way that they could not have known. They might not have known the detail of it, but they would have had to know that there was a major operation underway.
The big heist was just too big a robbery for Downing Street to ignore. Overnight, the peace process, the never-ending talks about talks in Ulster, collapsed. But what did Tony Blair say to Gerry Adams?
The Prime Minister made it pretty clear not long after all these events what his views were on this, and made his position absolutely clear to the leaders of Sinn Féin what his views were, in no uncertain terms. There was some talk, for example, of saying nothing, of cutting off talking to Sinn Féin at the time, and I didn't see that there was any sense in that. You need to talk to people in order to change the world, and certainly to change the ways of the IRA. So that was vitally.
Why would you say stop bank robbing?
Well, that is being said, and has been said many times.
But do they pay any attention?
Well, we haven't had any banks robbed since.
The veteran Republican Thomas Slab Murphy has been jailed for a year and a half for tax evasion. The 66-year-old was found guilty of 9 counts of failing to file tax returns for nearly a decade.
The Bureau is very pleased that with the outcome of the case.
This investigation began over a decade ago when the Criminal Assets Bureau began looking at the finances of the IRA and those associated with it. Thomas Slab Murphy was in charge of the IRA in the north. CAB searched his home and lands at Ballybinnaby in County Louth on the 9th of March 2006.
Vehicles, cash, cheques and a large quantity of cigarettes were among the items seized.
The uncashed cheques, over €500,000 worth. The Criminal Assets Bureau seized them, cashed them and banked the money for the state. And a large amount of cash in euro, sterling and old Irish pounds. It was stored in black refuse bags, hidden among hay bales in the cattle shed, but the Bureau is still not finished. It says there's a lot more tax to be collected from Tom Murphy. The more than €189,000 he owes for the 9 years covered by this criminal case, as well as another CAB tax assessment for over €5 million. The court sentenced Tom Murphy to a year and a half in prison.
Some of the most vicious episodes of the Troubles took place along the border. This contested space is the home of 66-year-old Tom Murphy. It's 31 years since the Sunday Times described him as the IRA's officer commanding for Northern Ireland. Over a 13-year period in Dublin's High Court and Supreme Court, he fought and lost a libel action. The newspaper had linked him to the IRA's bombing campaign in Britain. After the High Court ruled against him in 1998, he faced legal costs of £1 million.
I was lured to this shed, and this is where he got the beating.
It's a lonely place to end your days. But it was here, in this isolated barn, that Stephen Quinn says the IRA murdered his son.
I believe the IRA did this. I near enough know who did it. They don't like anyone standing up to them, so this is what they done. They beat him to death. Crowd of cowardly so-and-sos.
Breach Quinn raised her children in South Armagh, a Catholic family in a Republican community. But Paul fell foul of local IRA members engaged in petty disputes. He was just 21 when beaten to death.
We were just in the door and the nun came out and she says the doctors are doing their best, you know. And then the doctor came out and he shook our hands. He says they left nothing to fix. Every bone in his body was broken. The side of his ear was off.
It's believed Paul Quinn was ambushed, beaten and killed because he was involved in a row with the son of a senior member of the IRA. At least 9 men took part in the attack. Another 10 are suspected of acting as lookouts.
I hope that those that murder Paul can see Paul every night in their sleep and see themselves raining down the blows on Paul. because you wouldn't do it to a dog. They were dressed in boiler suits. They had balaclavas on them, they had their gloves on them, they had their iron bars, they had their sticks with nails in them. And they just lay into poor Paul. And I believe he shouted for them to stop at the beginning, but then he was beaten that much that they silenced him. He couldn't talk.
Paul Quinn's parents have always believed that the IRA killed him. At the time, police on both sides of the Irish border agreed, as did the government's international monitoring body. So it's difficult to understand how anyone could now claim to be surprised by claims that the terror group still exists. It's taken 8 years and another murder for the Democratic Unionists to consider ending their power-sharing arrangement with Sinn Féin.
I don't know why they're coming out now in 2015 when they didn't come out in 2007 when Paul was murdered.
This was an IRA stronghold. They called it bandit country, and there are remnants here. But this family won't be cowed for the sake of politics. They've lost too much.
There is no Republican involvement whatsoever in this man's murder. The people involved are criminals. They need to be brought to justice. And it's fairly obvious to me that this is linked to fuel smuggling and to criminal activity.
It's a position Sinn Féin have consistently repeated.
Paul Quinn was involved in smuggling and criminality, and I think everyone accepts that. You know, as I say, this is a very difficult situation because there's a family grieving here, and you don't want to add to that grief by saying things about your son.
Can you just tell me why was your son targeted, and what was the reason for his murder?
The reason was he fought with Republicans or IRA people from around here. He fought with the son of a leading IRA man, and another boy, there's supposed to be another IRA man in Cullyhanna. He fought with two of them.
This was just an ordinary dispute between youngsters?
A dispute between young ones. He told me about it, and I thought nothing of it.
I couldn't believe that Conor Murphy could come out and say such a thing. He said that Paul was a criminal, that he was murdered by criminals. Right, that he spoke to the IRA in Cullyhanna and they said they didn't do it.
They know exactly who they are, every one of them. There's a lot of people who are still afraid round here, a lot of people afraid of what's going on.
Who are they afraid of?
They're afraid of the IRA.
Here?
Here, yes.
To this day?
To this day, they're still afraid of them, yeah.
The Mr. Biggs behind the frauds on the frontier are the South Armagh Brigade of the Provisional IRA. South Armagh has been described as Sicily without the sun. For nearly 30 years, it's been the hub of terror and racketeering. One man has presided over all the murder and mayhem, Thomas Slab Murphy. All the dark rat runs that crisscross the Orchard County lead ultimately to a place called Hackball's Cross in County Louth.
Slab Murphy is the most influential figure in that whole area. No one smuggles anything down along the border without clearance of the IRA, and Slab Murphy is the IRA down there.
And that's happening today?
That's happening today and will happen for decades to come.
That dedication to the cause has earned Slab Murphy the public praise of Gerry Adams. The Sinn Féin president has described his friend Tom as a good Republican.
When Robert McCartney was murdered outside a Belfast bar in 2005, a veil of absolute silence shrouded the crime. The IRA and its political representatives, Sinn Féin, denied any involvement, and no witnesses would give evidence about what really happened the night he was killed. Sinead O'Shea continues her investigation.
3 years on, still nobody has come forward from McGuinness's, not even Robert's friends who were with him during the fight.
I don't know how they live with themselves. These are the people that told us after he was murdered that he was like a brother to them. who sat and cried in your living room and told you that if they could tell the truth they would, but they couldn't remember and all the rest of it, and they're sitting there with the truth.
The witnesses weren't the only people being intimidated. Within weeks of Robert's murder, hate mail had begun to arrive from the McCartneys as their profile grew.
Some of them were from, obviously, Republicans who were very annoyed about what we were doing, and some of those actually had excrement on it with the pictures of Robert and the two children with the excrement smeared on them.
Several times, McCartney family members had to be evacuated from their homes after receiving bomb threats. Whispering campaigns began against them. Those who helped them were targeted too. Conversely, during this period, some Sinn Féin and IRA supporters began to claim that they were being intimidated by the McCartney sisters.
The McCartney sisters intimidated the IRA, if only we'd have been able to intimidate the IRA. They were probably angry that we were challenging the IRA and still alive to tell the tale.
Within Shortstrand, as Catherine McCartney calls it, a wall of silence continues around the case. Even today, it is very difficult to find anybody who will speak on camera.
And 2 occasions my sons were assaulted by family members of people who were involved in Robert's murder.
Finally, after a picket outside Brigine's house, both Brigine and Paula, the last of the family to be living in Shortstrand, decided to move out. 6 months after Robert's murder, the IRA announced that it would begin the process of decommissioning.
Today marks the completion of the transition from conflict to peace.
Robert's case finally opened in the summer of 2008. Terence Davison had been charged with his murder. Within weeks, it had collapsed. The evidence from what should have been the 2 main witnesses, Brendan Devine and Edward Gowdy, the 2 men who had survived the fight, was minimal. Only one other witness came forward, Witness C, a passing motorist who misidentified Terence Davison. The judge said he had no choice but to release Davison and the other 2 defendants, James McCormick and Joseph Fitzpatrick, who had been charged with assault.
Fear still exists, and until that fear no longer exists, then we are not going to get justice.
Nobody from Sinn Féin, none of the 72 in the pub that night, took to the stand.
In February, Sinn Féin held a Circle the Wagons rally in Belfast's Hilton Hotel. The fallout from December's Northern Bank robbery continued. Gardaí and Cork had now launched a money laundering inquiry. The McCartneys' campaign was gathering momentum. One of those who spoke to RTE that night was a candidate Sinn Féin planned to run in the May local elections. Deirdre Hoggy was to stand in the Pottinger area where the McCartneys live.
Well, certainly, our hearts have to go out to the family of Robert McCartney, and we're thinking of them at this time of losing a family member, which is awful. But you have to keep in mind, and the leadership have confirmed as well as the IRA, that Republicans have nothing to do with this. And again, this is part of the onslaught by the media and governments and political parties to criminalise Sinn Féin and the Republican movement. And people now, are angered at these accusations.
What do ordinary Republicans think the people who murdered Robert McCartney should do?
I think again it's been shown over the last few weeks, that it's up to those to look into their own conscience, to take an informed decision on themselves for what it is they want to do. Certainly the leadership have confirmed, that they didn't act as Republicans, and again it's up to those to come forward and look into themselves.
Deirdre Hoggy hadn't mentioned during that RTE interview that she was in McGuinness's bar on the night of Robert McCartney's murder. 2 weeks after the interview, she was a delegate at Sinn Féin's Ardèche. A week later, it became public knowledge she had been in the bar. Sinn Féin subsequently announced she wouldn't be running in the May elections. In a statement to a solicitor, she said she saw nothing.
For some observers, it seems clear that the McCartney case was used by the authorities to bring Sinn Féin into the political process. And when this was achieved, the case was allowed recede into the background. Brendan Devine, who Robert was trying to defend when he died, is now in prison for armed robbery, maintaining that he remembers nothing from that night.
He did say at one point during the trial that he wasn't sure what he could say and what he couldn't say. Because the IRA are the boss. That's cowboy land.
There have been numerous other injustices in Northern Ireland in recent years, of which Robert's murder has been the most high profile. These, and the fear which continues to exist in Shortstrand and other communities like it, must sharply undermine the idea that Northern Ireland is now at peace, a model for other countries, and that our attention can now be turned away.
Sinead O'Shea on how peace can sometimes get in the way of justice.
There is gone.
We have a message for the British government.
for the Irish government, for the cabal that's out there. We ain't going away, you know.
We have some breaking news. Dennis Donaldson, the former senior
Sinn Féin official Dennis Donaldson has been found shot dead near Glenties in County Donegal.
Dennis Donaldson was a sitting duck for the IRA to take him out any time.
Steeped in republicanism, he was Gerry Adams' eyes and ears at Stormont. As Sinn Féin's Assembly Administrator, he was a party man.
I was a British agent. I was recruited in the 1980s. I've worked for British intelligence and the RUC PSNI Special Branch.
Can he return to Belfast?
He can do whatever he wants, frankly, and that's something that he has to work out. We shouldn't be naive. This is, in Republican and nationalist terms, well, even in Irish terms, to be an informer is pretty bad stuff. You know.
I mean, 15 or 20 years ago, he may have lost his life.
That's true.
So is he safe to return to Belfast?
Absolutely, he is. There is no, he has no fear from Republicans.
Well, I'll not be staying here too long now.
As he slept, his killer approached the cottage along the single track. A rock was thrown through the window. As he went to investigate, 2 shots were fired through the door. One shot caught his hand, almost severing it. The killer reloaded the shotgun and the door was kicked in. Dennis Donaldson was shot again in the chest and the head.
The murder of former IRA commander Gerry Davison last May sent shockwaves through Belfast republicanism. The police didn't know who did it, but others, desperate for revenge, decided they knew who it was. 3 weeks ago, they shot Kevin McGuigan dead in front of his wife. This time, the police had suspects in mind.
We believe that members of the Provincial IRA have been involved, along with others, in the murder of Mr. McGuigan.
This week, Ireland lost a hero. Derry lost a son. Sinn Féin lost a leader, and I lost a dear friend. Martin McGuinness was not a terrorist. Martin McGuinness was a freedom fighter.
I would have more respect for Martin McGuinness as he portrays himself as a person of democracy if he completed his democratic journey and he admitted some of the crimes that he's been part of. You mentioned Patsy Gillespie. Patsy Gillespie's widow, who's still alive today, knows exactly what happened and who ordered the death of her husband. Everybody in this room would have more respect for you, Martin, if you accepted your position and you started telling the truth.
Okay. I don't know who was involved in the bomb explosion, who took the life of Patsy Gillespie. Some people might think I do, but I don't.
Martin McGuinness has admitted to being a senior IRA commander. I meet him at Stormont.
Mr. McGuinness, where is Captain Robert Narrott's body? I haven't got a clue. Mr. McGuinness, why won't the IRA give up and South Armagh give up Captain Robert Narrott's body? I think, Dara, you know better than anybody else. If you want to request an interview with me about any matter, all you have to do is there's several ways to come along to my office, request the interview. Mr. McGuinness, Robert Narrott was murdered and disappeared 30 years ago. Is it not time we found out what happened to his body?
How do you square, Martin McGuinness, with your God, the fact that you were involved in the murder of so many people?
Well, I think that's a disgraceful comment to make. I was accused by Miriam of being a murderer. I think that was wrong.
I want justice for my father. I believe that you know the names of the killers of my father. And I want you to tell me who they are. You were on the Army Council of the IRA. Yes, you were. No, well, how do you know that? You're a liar. Well, I'm not a liar. You are a liar, yeah.
It is the nature of things that the part played by Republicans like Kevin during the long years of war will never be known. The tales will never be told. He had no time for loose talkers
or want their middies or spoofs. He was the real deal. An honest, decent Republican who saw off Thatcher, remember Thatcher, and her ilk, and brought the British government to the negotiating table.
Let me appeal to our unionist neighbours. Let us learn to like each other.
Notion of why increasingly unionists aren't voting is that they're squandered by the likes of Gregory Campbell. The fundamentalist bigotry, that's what it is. It's nothing got to do with politics, it's got to do with blind, bigoted hatred of people, and not just Catholics, of Presbyterians, of Church of Ireland, of everybody. So the point is to actually break these bastards. That's the point. And what's going to break them is equality. That's what's going to break them. Equality. Who could be afraid of equality? Who could be afraid of treating somebody the way you want to be treated? And that's what we need to keep the focus on. And that's the Trojan horse of the entire Republican strategy, is to reach out to people on the basis of equality.
Gerry, you talk about those mechanisms perhaps for truth and reconciliation. 6 months ago, Martin McGuinness told me if those mechanisms existed, he was quite prepared to talk about his past. If they existed, would Gerry Adams find it easier to talk about his past and his long alleged involvement in the IRA?
Yes, I have said, and Martin and I said this together, and we've said it quite a few times, that we would both do our best, and we would also encourage other Republicans to come forward if there was a satisfactory arrangement put in place, and that's my that's my commitment. Martin's not here, but that's still my commitment.